Snow swallowed the world in silence, but beneath a crooked pine, a boy sat trembling, barefoot, lips cracked, clutching a torn blue coat far too thin for the storm. He whispered once, barely a sound, "She left me. No shoes, no food, no one is coming." But the forest did not stay silent. A German shepherd named Valor broke through the snowdrifts, ears sharp, eyes burning with instinct. Behind him came Officer Silas Carter, his breath harsh against the cold, a man scarred by loss yet unwilling to turn away. In that frozen clearing, one broken boy, one loyal dog, and one weary man collided, and nothing in Asheville would ever be the same again. The storm had passed hours ago, but the world it left behind was stripped bare, a canvas of white silence. In the mountains on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina, the forest lay hushed under a blanket of snow so thick that every tree seemed burdened. Its branches stooped like weary sentinels. The sun had not yet pierced through the low gray sky, and the air clung with the sharp bite of ice. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the measured rhythm of paws pressing into the frost. Officer Silas Carter moved slowly, his tall, broad frame pushing through the snow as if every step was a decision. He was 42 years old, a man whose presence carried both strength and gravity. His skin was deep and warm in tone, his face carved by lines that told of long years on duty, of nights spent at crime scenes, of mornings that bled into afternoons without rest. His shoulders, wide and square, carried more than the weight of his uniform. They bore the grief of a husband who had buried his wife after cancer took her quietly, and the ache of a father whose only daughter had left for college in another state, unwilling to stay in a house that whispered of loss. Silas had been a good officer, steady, fair, calm under fire. Yet there were cases that never let him go. A child he hadn't reached in time, a family he had promised to protect that still fell apart. Those shadows haunted him, slipping into his dreams and filling the quiet hours of his cabin with a silence heavier than any snowfall. To the townspeople of Asheville, he was respected, even admired. But Silas himself lived in the company of ghosts, the only creature who understood that silence was the dog padding faithfully ahead of him. Valor, a German shepherd of 5 years, had once been a K9 unit. His coat was a striking sable, black blending into warm brown along his back and flanks, his muzzle dark, his eyes amber and watchful. He moved with the fluidity of training, every step measured, every ear twitched sharp. Yet there was a softness to his gait now, a loyalty that reached beyond command. He had been Silas's partner in more than one midnight call, more than one raid where the night could have turned fatal. But a leg injury sustained on a search operation had forced Valor into early retirement. Most dogs would have gone to another handler, another home. Silas refused. He brought Valor to live with him, not out of pity, but because he needed him as much as the dog needed someone to stay. The path that morning was routine, or at least it was meant to be. Silas often walked the forest trails after storms, checking for downed wires or signs of hikers who had gone astray. He preferred these circuits to sitting behind a desk at the precinct, where paperwork and chatter suffocated him. In the woods, the rhythm of boots and paws on snow kept his mind steady. Valor usually scouted ahead, tail level, head low, every sense attuned to the wilderness. Today, however, the dog froze suddenly, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Silas stopped, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, though he already knew the tone of Valor's silence. The dog gave a low, throaty whine, then darted left, crashing through a thicket where branches still clutched ice. Silas cursed under his breath and followed, his heavy boots breaking through crusted layers of snow, branches whipping at his jacket. The forest seemed to grow denser with each step, until suddenly it opened into a small clearing where a crooked pine leaned sideways, its trunk bent by storms. There, beneath the shadow of that tree, sat a child. The boy could not have been more than 7, his frame thin as a reed, knees drawn tight to his chest, bare feet pressed into the snow so long they looked almost blue. He wore a navy blue coat, frayed at the seams, one sleeve torn at the shoulder. His hair, pale and unkempt, clung to his forehead in frozen strands. His eyes wide, gray-blue, Hollow stared ahead, as if the world had already passed him by. Beside him, a small pack lay half open, but nothing inside could fend off the cold. Silas felt his chest tighten. He had seen many sights on patrol, but something about this boy made his throat close. He thought of the cases he could not forget, of children pulled from alleys or found too late in abandoned buildings. This one was alive, but just barely. Valor moved first, his tail lowered, ears angled forward. He padded toward the boy with a gentleness that contrasted the storm of muscle under his coat. He stopped a few feet away and let out a small whine. The boy flinched at first, then blinked, his cracked lips parting. Slowly, one trembling hand reached forward until his fingers brushed Valor's fur. The German shepherd leaned in, pressing his warmth into the boy's frozen hand. Silas knelt down, the cold biting his knees through the fabric. He pulled off his gloves, ignoring the sting of raw air. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice lower than usual, careful not to startle. "You're safe now. My name's Silas. This is Valor." The boy's gaze flicked up, hesitant, searching. He whispered something, so faint Silas leaned closer. "Ethan." "Ethan," Silas repeated, nodding slowly, anchoring the name as though saying it aloud made it real. He reached into his coat and pulled out the wool blanket he always carried on winter patrols, draping it gently over the boy's shoulders. Ethan shivered, but did not resist. His small fingers clutched the fabric as though it were the only solid thing left in his world. Silas studied him for signs. Frostbite on the toes, lips pale, trembling too constant. The boy was hypothermic, but still conscious. That was something. He wanted to ask a dozen questions. "Where are your parents? How long have you been here?" But something in the boy's eyes told him not to push. Trauma, he knew, had its own timing. He reached for his phone, but the screen blinked weakly, struggling against the cold. Signal flickered and died. He cursed softly. The roads into town were closed after the storm. He had heard it on dispatch earlier. Help wouldn't come soon. The boy needed warmth now. Silas lifted him carefully, his body feather-light against the officer's chest. Ethan made no sound, just pressed his face into Silas's coat, clutching at the collar. Valor walked close by, his head brushing the boy's dangling arm, as though tethering him to safety. The three of them trudged back through the snow, the storm clouds breaking just enough to reveal a sky the color of steel. As they walked, memories pressed against Silas's mind. His late wife, Naomi, who had once placed their daughter in his arms after birth, whispering, "Take care of her." He thought of his daughter, now grown, who seldom called. The silence in his house had grown unbearable since, each room echoing with what used to be. And now here was this boy, appearing in the snow like a ghost of responsibility returning. They reached the cabin, a modest wooden structure crouched on the edge of the forest, its roof burdened with white. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life against the winter's grasp. Silas pushed the door open, warmth from the old wood stove spilling into the cold air. He laid Ethan gently on the worn sofa, pulling another quilt from the cedar chest to wrap him tighter. Valor circled once before lying down between the boy and the door, as though making himself a barrier against the world. His amber eyes never left Ethan, watchful, steady, loyal beyond command. Silas crouched by the stove, stirring embers into flame, the fire crackling to life. For a moment he simply watched the boy's small chest rise and fall, each breath fragile, each one a victory against the cold. He did not know who had left him there, or why. But he knew this. Ethan was alive, and so long as he and Valor stood watch, the boy would not be abandoned again. The cabin's walls groaned softly against the weight of the storm, old timbers creaking like bones in the wind. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove spread slowly, filling the single-room space with the scent of burning oak and the faint tang of iron from the stove's belly. Silas Carter moved with deliberate care, setting a dented pot onto the stovetop, pouring water from a tin jug, his thick fingers steady even as his mind felt unsteady. The boy sat hunched on the sofa, the wool quilt drawn tightly around his narrow frame. He hadn't spoken since the woods, his eyes darting occasionally toward the window, as if afraid the storm itself might snatch him back. Silas studied him from across the room, not openly, but in small, careful glances. Ethan was slight, almost too slight for his age, with thin wrists poking from the sleeves of the oversized coat. His pale hair clung in wet clumps that framed a face sharp with hunger and weariness. The boy gripped a battered backpack so tightly it looked fused to him, his small fingers white at the knuckles. Whatever that bag held, it was more than belongings. It was survival, or perhaps memory. Valor stretched out on the braided rug between them, his body coiled, but his presence calming. The German shepherd's amber eyes flicked from the boy to Silas, as if bridging an unspoken space. Every time Ethan's shoulders trembled, Valor shifted closer, his tail sweeping the floor once, a subtle reminder that the boy was no longer alone. Silas didn't miss the way Ethan's hand, tentative and slow, rested on Valor's back. The soup simmered, steam fogging the cracked window panes. Silas ladled the thin broth into a chipped ceramic bowl, setting it gently on the table in front of Ethan. "It's warm," he said quietly, his voice roughened by years of restraint. "Might help." Ethan didn't move at first, his eyes fixed on the steam as though it were a trick. Then slowly he set the backpack down beside him, never out of reach, and pulled the bowl closer. He lifted the spoon with shaking hands, spilled half of it on the blanket, and flinched as if expecting reprimand. Silas said nothing. He only crouched to mop the spill with an old towel. Ethan's gaze flicked to him, uncertain, then down again. Halfway through the bowl, Ethan's lips parted. His voice was fragile, a whisper breaking through ice. "Ethan," he said, eyes not lifting. Silas froze. He repeated softly, "Ethan." The boy gave a small nod. It was not an introduction. It was a surrender of trust, the first fragile stone laid between them. While Ethan ate, Silas fetched his leather-bound notebook from the mantel. It was an old habit. He had always recorded details from patrols, even when not required. Now it gave him structure. He scribbled in block letters. Male, approximately. 7. Name, Ethan Cole. Condition, hypothermic, underweight, withdrawn. Clothes, torn navy coat. Jeans damp. No shoes. Backpack in possession. He paused at the next line. There were stains on the coat's sleeve, not just mud. Dark smudges, faint but unmistakable. Dried blood, though not fresh. He noted it down, jaw tightening. The landline on the wall crackled suddenly, the old rotary phone that rarely rang anymore. Silas snatched it up, his deep voice low. "Carter." On the other end, the dispatcher's tone was tight. The roads were blocked by fallen trees and snowdrifts. No units could get through until morning. "You're the closest," she said. "Keep him warm. We'll check back every hour." Silas agreed, setting the receiver down with a muted sigh. He looked at Ethan, who had already pulled the backpack back into his lap, his small arms wrapped around it like a shield. Night fell early. The storm howled outside, rattling shutters and making the cabin shudder. Inside, shadows danced on the walls, flickering in lantern light. Ethan had curled into one end of the sofa, the quilt cocooning him, the backpack beneath his chin like a pillow. His breaths were shallow but even. Valor lay stretched between the sofa and the door, head resting on his paws, every muscle ready. Occasionally, he lifted his head, ears twitching, throat vibrating with a low growl. Silas, seated at the small table with his notebook, lifted his eyes each time. "What is it, boy?" But Valor would only stare toward the window, then settle again, the growl fading into silence. Silas knew better than to dismiss it. Valor didn't spook without reason. Years of service had honed him into something instinctual, almost otherworldly. The dog's warnings had saved Silas more times than he could count. Tonight, it only deepened his unease. He added another note in his book. Valor restless, repeated growls toward north window. He turned his gaze back to Ethan. The boy twitched in his sleep, murmuring indistinct words, clutching the quilt tighter. Silas saw again the flinch when the soup spilled, the desperate grip on the bag. These were not marks of a child lost by chance. They were scars of abandonment, of being left behind. Silas thought of his daughter, years younger when Naomi passed. She had hidden in her room for days, clutching her mother's scarf as if the fabric could bring her back. Silas had tried to comfort her, but grief had set them both adrift. His daughter had eventually left, saying she couldn't breathe in a house where every corner whispered of her mother. He had let her go, believing space might heal. Yet here he was again, facing another child hollowed by absence. Near midnight, Valor's growl rose again, sharper this time. Silas stood, stepping to the window. He pulled back the curtain. The forest stretched silent, snow layered like bones on the ground. No figures, no lights, only the endless white. Still, his gut tightened. He fetched his service revolver from the cabinet, checked the chamber, and set it on the table within reach. He returned to his seat, the fire crackling low. The hours passed, marked only by the groan of the wind. Ethan stirred once, muttering something into the quilt. Silas leaned closer, listening. A word, broken, fragile. Sorry. His chest tightened. He wanted to ask what the boy meant, but he let the silence remain. Sometimes silence said more than questions. When dawn finally pushed pale light through the frosted windows, the storm had eased. The forest stood still, snow bending the branches, every surface glimmering. Silas stretched his sore shoulders, poured himself bitter coffee from the old percolator, and jotted another line into his notebook. Child stable, no fever, restless sleep. Further observation required. Ethan was awake, eyes bleary, face drawn. He sat upright on the sofa, the backpack clutched tight, Valor's head resting against his knee. It's his. For the first time, the boy looked at Silas directly, though the gaze was fleeting. There was a question there, unspoken but clear. Would he be sent away again? Silas crouched beside him, voice steady. You're safe here, Ethan, I promise. The boy said nothing, but his fingers tightened in Valor's fur, as if that alone might make the promise true. The morning after the storm was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made the woods feel heavier rather than lighter. The snow had settled deep, blurring the lines of paths and swallowing footprints into pale uniformity. Sunlight strained through heavy clouds, washing the landscape in muted silver. Silas Carter stepped out of the cabin, boots sinking into the powder, while Valor darted ahead, his breath forming white bursts in the crisp air. Ethan still slept inside, curled into the sofa with the quilt tucked under his chin, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm with dreams that seemed uneasy. Silas had not slept much. He had sat long into the night with his notebook open, the lamplight flickering, listening to every creak of the cabin. His mind circled endlessly over the boy, over the ballow he clutched, over the way he had whispered sorry in his sleep. Something wasn't right. Children didn't end up alone in snowstorms by accident. And now, with the world hushed after the blizzard, Silas's instincts told him answers were near, waiting to be uncovered. Valor, nose pressed to the ground, froze suddenly near the line of pines. His tail stiffened, ears pricked, muscles tightening. Silas knew the look. The dog had found something. He moved closer, crunching through snow until he reached the spot where Valor began digging furiously, sending sprays of snow flying with his strong forelegs. Within moments, the dog whined low, muzzle striking something harder than ice. Silas dropped to his knees, brushing snow aside until his fingers scraped against the edge of a plastic bag, half buried and frozen solid. He tugged it free, the cold stinging his skin even through gloves. The bag was cloudy but sealed tight. Inside were folded papers, edges worn, along with a couple of photographs warped at the corners. He carried it back inside, Valor padding close, eyes locked on the object as though he understood its importance. At the table, Silas slit the bag open with his pocket knife. He spread the contents across the wood. The first paper was a guardianship document dated 3 years prior. The name scrawled in legal ink, Candace Mercer. Appointed as temporary guardian of one minor, Ethan Cole, following the incapacitation of the biological mother, Laura Cole. Silas frowned, scanning further. The document was stamped with the county court seal, but something about the alignment of the type looked off. A forgery, perhaps, or at least tampered. The photographs told more than the words. One showed Ethan at about 3 years old, sitting in a daycare chair with a paper crown on his head, smiling faintly, his cheeks round with baby fat. The second photograph was more chilling. Ethan standing stiff beside a tall, angular woman with pale hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Her eyes were light, cold, and the hand on Ethan's shoulder was not affectionate, it was restraining. Silas felt a surge of heat in his chest. He had seen that grip before, in custody disputes and foster cases that ended poorly. He glanced toward the sofa. Ethan stirred faintly, still asleep, his arms locked around the backpack as though he knew what ghost lived inside it. Silas reached for the old rotary phone again, fingers stiff with urgency. The line crackled as the dispatcher connected him through to Detective Aaron Caldwell at the Asheville Police Department. Caldwell was in his late 50s, a career man with deep creases across his forehead and a gravelly voice that carried decades of late-night interrogations. He had worked with Silas before on missing persons cases, a cautious but sharp-minded investigator. "Carter," Caldwell's voice hummed through static. "Heard you found a boy." Silas explained quickly, laying out what he'd seen, what Valor had uncovered. He described the papers, the photographs, the forged guardianship, the name Candace Mercer. There was a pause, then Caldwell exhaled sharply. "That name came across my desk months back," he said. "A welfare fraud tip, never confirmed. And the mother, Laura Cole, she's alive." Silas gripped the receiver tighter. "Alive?" "Car accident put her in a coma almost 4 years ago," Caldwell explained. "She came out of it 2 months back. Memory fractured, but she's been asking about her son. No one could locate him. She was told a relative had custody, but records were a mess. If what you're holding is real, Mercer forged the paperwork, collected benefits, and when Laura woke, she panicked." Silas felt the room tilt. He looked again at Ethan, at the too small frame curled on his sofa. Abandoned, not by misfortune, but by design. Caldwell's voice dropped lower. "We need those documents. I'll get a team up there as soon as the roads are clear. Keep him safe, Carter. You may have just cracked open a case bigger than we thought." When the call ended, Silas sat still for a long moment, staring at the papers spread before him. His reflection caught faintly in the window, a man hollowed by loss, now suddenly holding someone else's fight in his hands. He thought of Naomi again, of the night she had gripped his hand in the hospital bed and whispered, "Don't let go of what matters." At the time, he had thought she meant their daughter, but now, watching Ethan stir awake with Valor's head pressed to his side, Silas wondered if fate had carried those words further. Ethan blinked awake, eyes bleary. He saw the papers on the table and froze, his hand clenching the quilt. Silas moved slowly, his voice soft. "It's all right, son. These are just papers. Nothing's going to hurt you here." Ethan said nothing, but his gaze lingered on the photograph of himself younger and the woman with the cold eyes. His lips pressed tight, and Silas realized the boy recognized her. To calm him, Silas shifted the papers aside and returned with a steaming mug of cocoa thin, made from powdered mix stored in his pantry, but warm. He placed it in Ethan's hands. "Here, drink." The boy sipped, his fingers trembling less with each swallow. Valor climbed onto the rug beside him, resting his head firmly on Ethan's lap until the boy's shoulders loosened. The day dragged on. Snow still blocked the road, the outside world unreachable. Silas wrote more notes in his book. Ethan avoids eye contact when shown photo of Candace Mercer. Exhibits recognition, displays attachment to Valor. Backpack remains guarded at all times. He thought of opening the backpack, but something told him it was not yet time. Trust had to be earned, not forced. That evening, as lantern light warmed the cabin walls, Silas sat across the room, watching Ethan doodle faint lines with a pencil he had given him. The boy sketched quietly on a scrap of paper torn from the notebook, shapes half-formed, but Silas noticed one thing repeated, a small dog-like figure beside a child. Even in silence, Ethan had found a way to tell his story, and in that moment, Silas felt something stir, a question he hadn't allowed himself before. Was this chance encounter not only about saving Ethan, but about saving himself? He had failed children before, cases that haunted him. Perhaps this was his reckoning, or his redemption. He didn't yet know. But Valor's steady breathing and the faint scratch of Ethan's pencil told him he had been placed here, now, for a reason. Night settled over the mountains like a heavy cloak, the kind that muffled even the smallest sound. The cabin, with its old timber walls and patched roof, stood as a lone sentinel in the whitened clearing. Inside, the fire glowed in the wood stove, throwing orange patterns across the log walls. Ethan had fallen asleep on the sofa, his head tucked beneath the quilt, the backpack pressed to his chest as though it was stitched to his very being. Valor stretched across the floor, his head near the boy's dangling hand, his amber eyes half closed but never fully resting. Silas sat at the table, his leather-bound notebook open in front of him, though his pen had long stopped moving. He had written the name Candace Mercer again and again across the margins, as if repetition might summon clarity. His mind replayed Caldwell's voice over the phone, the words about Laura Cole waking from her coma, asking about her son, and the fraud that had stolen years of a boy's life. The fire crackled, but Silas's thoughts wandered back to darker nights, to one case in particular. He remembered it clearly, a girl left in an abandoned trailer outside of town. He had arrived late, the blizzard fierce, and by the time he found her, her small hands had frozen still. He had stood in the doorway then, the cold gnawing at his bones, hating himself for being too slow. That face had never left him. Tonight, as he glanced toward Ethan's fragile form, he swore silently that history would not repeat itself. Valor's sudden growl shattered the quiet. The dog surged upright, ears forward, body tense. Silas snapped his head toward the window. The sound was not a casual warning. It was low, guttural, carrying the certainty of threat. Silas rose from his chair, every muscle taut. He crossed to the window and drew back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The snow glittered faintly under the moonlight, untouched except for a line of impressions near the tree-lined boot prints, narrow and deliberate. His hand drifted to the revolver on the mantel. He slipped it into his belt and pulled on his coat, his voice low to Valor. "Stay sharp, boy." Ethan stirred slightly at the sound of the growl but did not wake. Silas pushed through the door into the cold night. The air bitted his lungs, silence pressing close, broken only by the crunch of his boots and Valor's quiet, steady movements beside him. He crouched near the prints, running his gloved fingers along the shallow depressions. They were fresh, no more than an hour old. Someone had been watching. Before he could follow them, the cabin door slammed open behind him. Silas whirled. A figure had slipped inside. He sprinted back, Valor racing ahead, and burst into the cabin to find Ethan sitting upright on the sofa, wide-eyed, clutching his backpack, while a woman loomed over him. Candace Mercer looked older than the photographs, but not weaker. She was tall, early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and pale eyes that reflected no warmth. Her blonde hair was tangled, greasy, tied back in a knot that had slipped loose. Her coat hung too large on her narrow frame, threadbare at the cuffs, and in her right hand glinted the edge of a kitchen knife, lifted toward the boy. "Get away from him!" Silas barked, his revolver leveled. Candace's gaze flicked to him, her mouth tightening. "He's mine," she hissed. "You don't understand. Without him, I have nothing. Nothing." Valor exploded forward before Silas could move, the shepherd's body a blur of muscle and fur. He struck her arm, teeth clamping down hard. Candace shrieked, stumbling back, the knife clattering to the floor. Ethan cried out and buried his face against the quilt, clutching Valor's tail as if it were an anchor. Silas surged forward, knocking the knife aside with his boot. He slammed Candace against the wall, pinning her wrist as she struggled, eyes wild. "You left him to die in the snow," Silas growled, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to claim him now." She twisted, sobbing, rage and desperation tangled in her voice. "I fed him. I clothed him. Do you think anyone else would? His mother was gone. They gave me nothing but scraps. The checks, those checks were the only thing keeping me alive. When she woke up, they would have cut me off. I had no choice." "You had a choice," Silas snapped, "and you chose to abandon a child." Her body slackened for a moment, shoulders trembling as Valor's teeth released her arm but stayed close, a low growl rumbling. Silas kept her pinned until flashing lights cut across the snow outside, the sheriff's SUV and two cruisers, their sirens muffled by the thick air. The door swung open, and Detective Caldwell stepped in first, his tall frame filling the doorway. Gray hair bristled under his hat. Behind him, deputies moved swiftly, cuffing Candace as Silas stepped back, chest heaving. Caldwell's lined face was grim but steady. "We'll take it from here." He glanced at Ethan, who sat frozen on the sofa, Valor pressed against him. The boy's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. Candace was dragged outside, her voice breaking into pleas and curses, until the sound was swallowed by the engines. Silas exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline ebbed. He sat down slowly beside Ethan, who trembled, his small hand gripping Valor's fur like a lifeline. Silas brushed a hand gently over the boy's pale hair. "She won't hurt you again," he said quietly. For a long moment, only the fire filled the silence. Then Ethan whispered, his voice faint, raw. "She said it was my fault. She said I was bad." His eyes didn't meet Silas's, but the words cut through the room like a blade. Silas felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. He had heard similar words from his daughter years ago, when she had told him she couldn't stay in a house full of grief, when she had blamed herself for not being able to save her mother. Children always carried burdens, never meant for them. He pulled Ethan closer, Valor pressing his body along the boy's side. "No, son," Silas said, his voice firm and warm. "You are not bad. You were never bad. She lied." Ethan's lips trembled. He buried his face into Valor's fur, silent tears soaking the dog's coat. Valor didn't move, didn't flinch, just held his ground, eyes fixed on Silas as though affirming the vow. That night, after the officers had gone and the cabin had returned to silence, Silas sat in the chair opposite the sofa, notebook open but empty. The fire burned low, the boy finally asleep again with Valor curled beside him. Outside, the boot prints were already vanishing under fresh layers of snow, as if the forest itself wanted to erase her presence. Silas watched them sleep, remembering the child he had lost in that old case years ago. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the ghost inside him quiet. He would not fail this child, not now, not ever. The snow had begun to soften in Asheville, though the cold still lingered like a guest reluctant to leave. Days had passed since Candace Mercer had been taken away in handcuffs, her pale face twisted in rage and defeat as the cruisers carried her down the mountain road. In the cabin, the air felt different, now lighter, as if the walls themselves had shed a weight. Ethan no longer clutched his backpack every second, though it still stayed near. At night, he slept with Valor's thick body pressed against him, the dog's steady breathing a rhythm of reassurance. Silas kept his routines, chopping wood, recording notes, boiling oatmeal. But beneath it all, a hum of anticipation pulsed, because news had come from Detective Caldwell. Laura Cole was on her way. Silas stood on the porch that morning, the horizon clear after days of storms. His tall frame cast a long shadow on the snow, his wool coat drawn tight against the brittle air. His face, dark and carved with years of service, was solemn yet softened by something rare hope. Beside him, Valor sat upright, ears flicking at every sound, as if he too expected someone important to arrive. Inside, Ethan pressed his face to the frosted window, his small hands leaving smudges as he breathed fog onto the glass. The growl of an engine broke the silence. A black SUV turned onto the snowy track, its tires crunching through the drifts until it came to a halt before the cabin. From the passenger door stepped Laura Cole. She was 34, though sorrow had aged her beyond the number. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose knot, her cheeks pale against the cold, and her eyes green-shadowed but fierce searched the clearing, as though every breath carried the weight of years lost. She was small, barely 5'3", her figure slight beneath a gray wool coat borrowed from the hospital's donation closet. Her hands trembled, not from the cold but from fear that this reunion would shatter like glass. Sheriff Caldwell stepped out after her, his broad frame a familiar anchor, his lined face firm yet softened by quiet compassion. He tipped his hat toward Silas, then gestured for Laura to move forward. She did, each step slow, as if the snow might break beneath her. The cabin door creaked. Ethan stepped outside, still wrapped in Silas's old quilt, his blonde hair tousled, his small feet hidden inside boots 2 sizes too large. He froze when he saw her. His blue-gray eyes widened, unsure, wary. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Laura's voice cracked through the silence. "Ethan?" It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a whisper, ragged from disuse, trembling with love held too long. The boy clutched the quilt tighter, his lips parting, but no sound came. Valor nudged him gently from behind, his amber eyes locked on the woman. Slowly, Ethan took a step forward. Then another. His lips quivered. "Mama?" Laura fell to her knees in the snow, arms open, sobs breaking from her chest before her son reached her. Ethan ran, quilt trailing, and collided with her embrace. She clutched him so tightly it seemed she might fuse him back into herself, her cries muffled in his hair. He buried his face into her coat, small shoulders shaking. The mountain air filled with their cries, and Silas looked away, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Valor stood close, watching, his ears tilted back, his chest rising with a huff as if relieved. Laura reached out a trembling hand to him, her fingers brushing the thick fur of his neck. "You found him," she whispered through tears. "You kept him alive." Valor pressed his head into her palm, accepting without words. The days that followed were a blur of healing and paperwork. Candace's trial came swiftly, the evidence undeniable. She was sentenced to years behind bars for falsification, fraud, and abandonment. The case made headlines in Asheville, a reminder of how neglect hides in plain sight. For Silas, it was closure, not only for Ethan, but for the ghosts that had haunted him. 1 week later, the town gathered in its modest community hall, a wooden building strung with flags and warmed by pot-bellied stoves. The hall was crowded, townspeople, officers, families. On stage, Sheriff Caldwell stood tall in uniform, his mustache bristling, his gravelly voice ringing with pride. "Today," he said, "we honor a guardian who cannot speak, but whose actions spoke louder than any words." Valor was led to the stage by Silas, his sable coat brushed, his amber eyes steady under the lights. The hall fell into a hush as Caldwell draped a bronze medal on a red ribbon around the dog's strong neck. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing against the rafters. But the moment that silenced the hall came not from the sheriff, nor from Silas. It came from Ethan. The boy, now in a clean navy sweater that hung loose on his thin frame, stepped forward timidly. His blonde hair had been combed, though a few locks refused to stay down. He looked out at the crowd, his small hand clutching the microphone stand. His voice was soft, shaking, but it carried. "Valor was the first to know I needed to be loved." The words pierced the air. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers. Laura covered her mouth, her shoulders trembling. Silas felt his throat tighten, his hands clenching at his sides. The boy who once whispered sorry in his sleep had found the courage to speak truth to a room of hundreds, and he had done it because of a dog. When the applause came again, it was gentler, deeper, as though every clap was a prayer of gratitude. Later that evening, as the hall emptied and lanterns dimmed, Silas sat alone at the edge of the stage, Valor's head on his knee. Laura and Ethan sat together nearby, their laughter quiet but real. For the first time in years, Silas felt the knot in his chest loosen. He thought of Naomi, of the promise he had made at her bedside. He had failed once, but not this time. This time, he had helped deliver a boy back into the arms of his mother, and in doing so, found a fragment of his own redemption. As the snow glittered faintly outside, Silas closed his notebook and set it aside. Some stories no longer needed to be written, they were alive, breathing, healed. The snow may melt and the seasons may change, but the bond between a child, a man, and a faithful dog will outlast any winter. What began as a night of fear ended as a story of love, redemption, and the quiet ways God works through unlikely protectors. Valor did not have wings, but he was sent at the right moment, proving that even in the darkest silence, love will find a way. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what moved you most. Do you believe dogs like Valor are angels sent to watch over us? Let us know below. And if you believe every child deserves love and every act of loyalty matters, Please like this video and follow our channel for more stories of hope, faith, and second chances.